Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Here I am on Parliament Square, London, in front of the statue of David Lloyd George. A figure who's not so well known now, but deserves to be better known, and was adulated for much of the early 20th century. It's a highly controversial figure, but long after he ceased to be Prime Minister, many people thought he would return to office in some capacity, not necessarily as Prime Minister. And he's a man who's partly responsible for the Allies winning the First World War, who did so much to reshape the world, for good or ill, in the 1920s. So he was born in Manchester in 1865. He was Welsh, perhaps the first Welsh Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was born, obviously, in Manchester to Welsh parents. And his surname was actually George. However, when he was a toddler, his father, who was a teacher, died. So he was brought up mainly by his maternal uncle, Mr. Lloyd. And so that's why he gave himself the double-barrel surname Lloyd George. Some Conservative politicians often refer to him as David George, forget the Lloyd, or just George, just the surname, saying don't give him a double-barrel surname, it suggests he is well got when he comes from humble origins, as Lloyd George used to like to say he was cottage bred. He was not as working class as he pretended, because, as I say, his dad was a teacher, he's brought up by his uncle who was a solicitor. So when he was very little, he moved to Wales, and he grew up in a small town there, Carnarvonshire. Later on, he used to represent the constituency of Carnarvon boroughs, as opposed to the county of Carnarvon. Anyway, so he was a Protestant, and he was part of a small denomination called the Disciples of Christ. So the Church of England was the established church in Wales at the time. And yes, it was called the Church of England, not the Church of Wales. The Welsh language was spoken by about 25% of Welsh people as their daily language now, and it's even more so in the mid-19th century. The Church of England conducted worship only in English, and some people, low church Protestants, that's to say Presbyterians, Baptists, whoever else, Methodists, and indeed the Disciples of Christ, often resented the dominance of the Church of England, and the gentry were almost to a man Anglicans. There were very few Catholics in Wales at the time. So he became involved in the Liberal Party. He left school at 16, and he was a bright boy. He began working in a solicitor's office as a clerk. That's the way they did it, and they did their articles. They were about 6 years sitting some law exams and learning informally. So solicitors didn't have to have degrees until very recently, not until the 90s. And in the old days, solicitors almost always learnt on the job. Just joined a firm as a teenager and graduated several years later. So that was him. He was a highly successful solicitor, involved in the Liberal Party, and really got into politics in the 1890s. As he was on the radical wing of the party, thought that a lot more needed to be done, and that really all men over 21 should have the right to vote, because in those days, if you'd lived in an address for under a year, you were not permitted to vote. And this disenfranchised people like migrant labourers. Or who else would it disenfranchise? Oh yes, if you're an adult but living with your parents, you didn't get to vote. You had to be sort of an independent man, head of the household. Not necessarily owning the house, could be renting the house. So in 1899, the Second South African War broke out. The Boer War is often called. Fought between the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State on one side against the British Empire on the other. They were technically part of the British Empire. They'd recognised the Queen's paramountcy. Anyway, so soon Afrikaner civilians, that's these white South Africans of Dutch descent, were put into concentration camps. And it's very misleading the way the Nazis in Germany misused this expression. It was a fairly benign term at the time, as in they were going to be housed and fed and get some sort of medical care and not be just caught in the crossfire, because it was a guerrilla campaign. And the British commander Kitchener argued that a lot of these Boer farmers, well, these are not really farms. These are enemy bases. That's their supply depot. The civilians are their intelligence network. So we're going to lock them up. They're not forced to work or anything. Nobody was beaten, or not a single person was deliberately killed of those civilians. However, they've been a very diffuse population. They were brought together, and so communicable diseases spread quickly, and healthcare was not adequate, and so on. So people said, Lloyd George said these were conditions of barbarism, and that provoked an outcry. So he felt the United Kingdom was in the wrong in this war, and in fact it had demanded too much, had been upping the ante. and had there been a more patient approach to diplomacy, the fighting might have been avoided. The United Kingdom won in the end, but Lloyd George was accused of being pro-Boer for criticising his own country. Famously, there was a meeting at Birmingham Town Hall he addressed at an anti-war meeting, and the Conservative mob wanted to tear him apart. So the police had to swap clothes with him, and he escaped disguised in a police officer's uniform. So finally, 1905, that December, the Liberals got into government under Sir Henry Campbell as Prime Minister. Pretty soon Lloyd George was Chancellor of the Exchequer, as in charge of the country's money. And there was a 1906 landslide. Soon enough he brought in the People's Budget with super tax, or surtax they call it for short. Some people said it's a bit like surtax, S-I-R, as in for knights and baronets having to pay so much. So the difficulty was in paying to expand the Royal Navy, because the Anglo-German naval race, and also old age pensions and so on. Well, he was adulated by many people. Some people thought he was Lord George. People thought that no one could have achieved something so magnificent without actually being a peer of the realm. Because remember, up until those days, elderly people no longer capable of supporting themselves, well, what were they going to do? They might have to go to a workhouse, and he really didn't want that to happen. He brought in a benefit system. It was contributory. Employer, the government, and the worker all paying in. There was some sickness or unemployment benefit. So these were the very stirrings of the welfare state. Invented unemployment offices, labour exchanges, because otherwise a man had to go from place to place, always asking for work, and all sorts of things. So these were major steps forward, highly controversial at the time. The Conservative Party fought against it tooth and nail. Well, then the 1910 election, the Liberals didn't do so well. Two 1910 elections, that is, and House of Lords trying to block the People's Budget, don't want to get too much into it. And then the Liberals are dependent on the Home Rule Party for support, and then the Home Rule crisis blew up. But so the First World War broke out in 1914, and he was foursquare behind the war, saying this war is morally right, just as the South African War was morally wrong. The Prime Minister by that time was H.H. Asquith, a Liberal, but he started drinking very heavily. He hit the bottle because his son Raymond was killed. And December 1916, there was a shells crisis, as in not enough munitions were produced, a lot of them were dud, and that was part of the explanation for the Battle of the Somme not going very well. Probably not a very convincing explanation, but I shan't go into the real reasons. So December 1916, he organised a parliamentary coup, as in a small faction of the Liberals, Lloyd George Liberals, and the Conservative Party managed to force out the Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith, and Lloyd George became Prime Minister. However, Asquith was still leader of the Liberal Party. So we had Lloyd George, a Liberal, leading a mostly Conservative government. There's a wartime coalition. Those two parties and a faction of Labour formed the government. And the opposition benches was half the Labour Party and most of the Liberal Party, as well as the Irish Home Rule Party. And so that's how he led the country to victory in 1918, of course mainly achieved by the United States and France. He had initially been very worried by the February Revolution in Russia, 1917. He was petrified that Russia might withdraw from the First World War. The Western Allies were having great trouble holding the German army off on the Western Front. But if there was no Eastern Front, if the Germans were able to transfer their entire might to the Western Front, it seemed like the Western countries would have very little chance of winning the war. And so he was enormously relieved when the provisional government of Russia announced they were going to continue to fight on in defense of the revolution. He then hailed the February Revolution as the greatest victory thus far in the cause for which we've all been fighting, which seemed astonishing, bearing in mind the Tsar had been praised to the moon by the British government up until that time because he was a valuable ally. Anyway, and there's this controversy. Why was the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, not permitted to seek asylum in the United Kingdom in 1918, when things were really turning hairy for him? Was it Lloyd George advised King George V not to permit his cousin to come? Or was it on George V's initiative that permission was refused to Nikolai II? Anyhow, so there was the Paris Peace Conference. Lloyd George, he was married, he had several children, but he was also a notorious libertine. He was asked if he was going to take his wife to the Paris Peace Conference, to which he riposted, "Would you take your wife to a banquet?" The goat, as he was known. So he had his wife here, he was having an affair with the doctor's wife in Merionethshire, when it was a very long railway journey. He's back to see his wife and his lover there, and also his his daughter's tutor, Pamela Stevenson. Anyway, so things were going fairly well for him. The coupon election of 1918, Lloyd George and the Conservative leader, Bonar Law, gave a coupon to various candidates to say, we endorse this Liberal here, that Conservative here, so as in pro-government candidates, where the Liberal and Conservative wouldn't be standing against each other. So Lloyd George continued as Prime Minister of a mostly Conservative government with a few Liberals on his side, but again, the main faction of the Liberal Party was against him. Where a house cannot stand divided against itself, as Lincoln might say. But anyway, 1922, he's finally forced out as Prime Minister, and the Conservatives got one of their own, Andrew Bonar Law, in as Prime Minister. So Lloyd George never served in the cabinet again. And that's why there's the 1922 committee of Conservative backbenchers. They thought that Lloyd George had let them down over the Chanak crisis, when British troops in Turkey were surrounded by the Turkish army, who demanded they leave, and the British decided to revise the Treaty of Sèvres. So did some of the other Western allies, and give away some of the concessions they'd won from Turkey at the end of the First World War. Well, he was obviously Prime Minister at the time of the conflict in Ireland, 1919 to 21. This was an irregular conflict, and he was lambasted because the police in Ireland sometimes behaved badly. And indeed, it was a time in Croke Park when they shot dead 14 civilians. Badly is not good enough. Were they fired upon by the crowd or not? And even so, was their response excessive? So certainly there was some grave wrongdoing, up to and including murder by the Crown forces, not on a large scale. But that's why he's execrated in Ireland. So Lloyd George, he was an MP for many more years, and then he was ennobled in the New Year's Honours in 1945 as Earl of Dwiffor, if I got that right. He passed away in March 1945. You can see footage of his funeral on YouTube. So the Liberal Party really became feebler, partly because of the split he caused, various other reasons. His son, Gwilym Lloyd George, was a Conservative Home Secretary in the 50s, the time Ruth Ellis was hanged, and his daughter Meghan was a Labour MP. Well, that is Lloyd George. He married his mistress shortly before he died, because his own wife had passed away. An absolutely fascinating figure, as they said, looked like a goat, head far too big for him, jet black hair with some very white hair, a fantastic public speaker, a man of enormous charisma, wit and vivacity, sorely missed.